afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here so late in the afternoon. I hope that if your energy levels are waning, that you will take a moment to revive yourself, because this is very much an action-oriented end of the keynote talks. I hope that you will consider it as an appetizer to our main course later. It is a work in progress, and it requires your response. And therefore, I'm very pleased to be here to introduce you to something you may already be involved with, but I hope to bring you some greater depth in the ways in which faith-based actors and organizations are involved with the United Nations, using the idea of a confluence of rivers. But before I begin, I would just like to thank our two bishops and our conference organizers, and for the Diocese of Lincoln and the University of Lincoln for bringing us here. It is truly an honor and a very enriching conversation, especially to have so many of us working on the same topic from very different perspectives. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I am Susie Sunshine. I am an optimist by nature, and it has pained me to listen to the grief in the room, grief which I also feel. But I'm hoping that at the end of this presentation, you will be filled with a sense of hope and also your own agency and action, which I'm sure you are already doing in your own contexts. But I hope to give you a few tools that are very practical so that you can use your faith in action from wherever you are. Now, I preface that by saying that not everyone here, admittedly, is a person of faith. However, I would like to challenge that assumption and say that for those of you who do not necessarily consider yourselves people of faith, I'm sure you have a sense of faith in humanity and a faith in what we can do as all together in order to address the crisis before us. And so this includes not only faith-based actors, which is something I know better than other actors, but you can also consider this a presentation for you if you are a scientist, if you are a teacher, if you are a student, if you are a local political leader, or simply an interested observer. So this is for all of you, and you'll be able to customize this with you over dinner. So my name is Lynnaia. I work for the Episcopal Church. We are one of 40 provinces of the Anglican Communion. I am one of 3 from the Episcopal Church. You've met Bishop Mark and Sheila Andrus, and we have worked together for about 4 or 5 years now in a very specific realm related to climate change action. Some of what I'll share here will be supplemented, I hope, by their own expertise as well as that of Reverend Rachel Carnegie from the Anglican Alliance. And so this is very much a joint and team effort that we bring to you. So with apologies to our river scientist, because I'm very much a layperson looking for a metaphor, let me propose to you the idea of faith in action at the United Nations being a confluence of rivers. Now, fortunately or unfortunately for you, my understanding of the confluence of rivers is really very basic. But it describes quite nicely, I think, one of the main concepts for understanding the United Nations and its role in the world and the place of faith-based actors in it. So we think of a confluence, and by the way, this is the confluence of the rivers Baker and Nef in Chile. It's quite a beautiful picture, and what I like about it in particular is how it shows the coming together of 2 distinct bodies with a mingling and a mixing and a swirling together so that they're both distinct, but in coming together, they're not exactly what they used to be. And that is very much a good way to describe what happens at the United Nations. Although this is a confluence of 2 rivers, in fact, we can easily think of the United Nations as being a confluence of 3 rivers: member states, UN agencies, and what we call civil society. Civil society might be a term that is already familiar to you. The UN is full of all kinds of acronyms, as you can imagine, and so we'll just simplify it and say that civil society is also called non-governmental organizations. So if you are acting within the UN sphere and you are not representing a government, you might be representing a UN agency, or you might be representing the rest of the world, which is probably most of us in the room, what is known as civil society. river, we might say there is a current that we might call the current of faith. And in the United Nations system, those are referred to most commonly as faith-based organizations. The terminology is important. I am a former academic, so I love defining concepts. I will try not to get too geeky on you and going too much into the details, but I love to talk about it. So if you want to talk, let's talk over dinner. So I imagine that most of us have had some encounter with the United Nations at this point, and so I don't want to belabor this too much, but just to keep us on the same foundational level, founded in 1945, not by any means the first attempt at international peace and dialogue. We can speak of the League of Nations if there was more time. The main thing to know is it's made up of 6 main organs and numerous funds, programs, and specialized agencies. General Assembly, Security Council, all you need to do is open your newspaper and you know what we're talking about. An important point for us to understand is that today the role of the United Nations has expanded to what are known as 5 main pillars of action. So from an original idea of international peace and security, these other objectives have been added, and many of them touch on the issues of climate change, of course. This is the United Nations in 2019. Thankfully, we only have 45 minutes for this presentation. I would certainly bore you if I were to go through all of this, but this gives you an idea of the complexity of the UN system. Thank God I don't need to know every detail either, but let me just point out to you the 6 main organs that we're talking about: General Assembly, Security Council, Economic and Social Council, Secretariat, International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council, which is pretty much defunct. But important for our discussion today is to understand the different specialized agencies, which I will talk about as UN entities or UN agencies, just to be a little more fluid in the discussion. Within the UN system, and this third river, shall we say, river of civil society, we can break this down into a couple different components. It's important in this presentation that I'm going to talk to you about faith-based actors and faith-inspired actors versus faith-based organizations, which are also called religious non-governmental organizations. The differentiation is here. There are both informal and formal ways of interacting with the United Nations, and that's quite important because what it means to you is that you have a means of action. Now, how many of you are already officially connected somehow with the UN system? 3, 4? Okay, that's what I thought. For most of us, it probably seems an ocean away, several oceans away, on the other side of Moana, right? Something where world affairs are decided that sound quite complex, and how do they relate to us? They relate to us very directly, and no matter where you are on the planet, you can participate. And hopefully this will show you how. So a formal means of communication or association with the UN for NGOs is through what's called the Department of Global Communications, or something called ECOSOC consultative status. So what this means is that if you are an NGO, for example, the lady who spoke about climate grief this morning, or shared your grief and had that beautiful meal for us yesterday, it is possible for your organization to associate with the United Nations. It can happen at the most local of levels, and that is often a very easy means to participate. The main thing to know is that with consultative status, an organization is able to participate more fully in the advocacy side of what happens at the UN. So we're going to go now through a very brief history of faith in action at the United Nations. If you're like most people in the world, when you think of the UN, you probably think of the Secretary General. You probably think of some very bizarre world leaders who in September grabbed the microphone in New York, and depending upon what country you're in, you hold your head in despair and think, may this moment pass quickly. And all of that is part of the United Nations. But often a hidden part of it is the faith that has been present and is system from its very beginning. And this is the way in which faith-inspired actors or faith-based actors is quite an important term. Let me give you some examples. This was the Conference of San Francisco in 1945. I apologize, the slides are a bit wonky because of the projection. But this was the original conference in 1945 at which, in San Francisco, at which the United Nations was founded with the signing of the UN Charter. And over here, Bishop Mark and Sheila in particular will be able to tell you more, is a mural from Grace Cathedral, which is their home, which depicts the actual events surrounding the Conference of San Francisco. And so right from the beginning, we have the inclusion of an element of faith at the Conference of San Francisco, and I invite you to talk to them about more details which I myself am not aware of. Does anybody recognize this lady? Yeah. Well, I put it up there for you, right? We Episcopalians are very proud of Eleanor Roosevelt. She features in a text called Holy Women, Holy Men. Now, I hasten to add she was not acting on behalf of the Episcopal Church, as far as we know. She was acting as a member of the U.S. delegation. But very, very important figure in the origins of the United Nations, and especially in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A faith-inspired actor, a faith-based actor, although we can't say exactly how, but we know she was a person of faith. This person, does anybody recognize? Yes. Hopefully we all do. I had a wonderful conversation with my neighbor at dinner last night about Dr. Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations. He wrote a very important book, and it's a very easy book that I commend to you called Meditations, which is a book of meditations and prayers that he wrote at about the time that he was Second Secretary General. And this particular quote has struck me, so I've placed it here for you. I am the vessel, the draft is God's, and God is the thirsty one. Dr. Hammarskjöld was the Secretary General in place when the UN headquarters had established a meditation room which you can visit today. It is, in the midst of all the talk, one of the most beautiful places to go because it's completely silent. And you certainly do need that in a busy place like the UN and a busy place like New York. And as you will see from this quote, he talks about the silence and the fact that this space is meant to represent no particular faith, but all faiths through silence. This room is here today. You can go visit it. If you come to visit New York, I'll be happy to take you there. And so it is meant to be a symbolic center for the United Nations, where all faiths are present, along with the member states who are in dialogue there. Now it all sounds quite rosy, doesn't it? It all sounds like we had a good faith foundation behind the founding of the United Nations. But a lot happened between Dr. Hammarskjöld and the year 2000. And I invite you to think of the place of faith in the United Nations as the ebb and flow of a river. Sometimes the river is full, and sometimes it is not. And similarly, the role of faith at the United Nations has had an ebb and flow. In between the time of the founding of the United Nations and 2000, we went through a period that we could consider a time of allergy, shall we say. Member states were not at all interested in working with faith-based actors. Much of that had to do with the fact that the United Nations is an intergovernmental space. And so civil society has a very marginal space within that. But also the idea that the United Nations is a secular space, and therefore no particular religion should dominate in that space. You can add to that for many faith organizations, there was also an element of being a little suspicious of this idea of creating some kind of world authority. Some of the more extreme theories surround the idea of the Antichrist, for example, the one world government, which was planning to take over the world and therefore represented Satan. And so that even comes up today in some of the views that Christians hold, in particular, of the United Nations. And I would be happy to explain to you why I do not believe that to be the case. Don't want to be that close to the devil. Thank you very much. What has happened between that and the year 2000 is a couple things. We have moved from a time, and this is good news for all of us in the room, where the United Nations is much more open to working with faith-based actors like yourselves. So we have moved from a time of allergy to embrace. Now, before meeting Jesus and having him overturn my life, like I explained yesterday, I was an academic in international relations, and so I can get very excited about international relations theory. And as part of my preparation for this, I took the scholarly approach that I used to have. And I found that in the world of international relations, from an academic perspective, there is a period in the 1990s when there was an increasing interest in the role of faith-based organizations in international relations that wasn't there when I left the field in 2000. What happened was, at about this time, the United Nations woke up to the fact that, gee, faith-based organizations have meeting spaces, and they're located in communities. And when the World Food Program wants to deliver aid, how are they going to do it? They're going to go to a church. They're going to go to a temple. They're going to go to a synagogue. And so, actually, faith-based organizations are quite useful. We can partner with them in order to accomplish some of the goals of the United Nations. And so there was an increasing interest in the role of faith-based organizations at the United Nations because of this. And it has taken off to become part of the work of several UN agencies. The year 2000 was a turning point, which is why it has a slide here. This represents the first time that 1,000 religious leaders gathered at the United Nations, thanks to the work of former Secretary General Kofi Annan, I should say late Secretary General Kofi Annan, who is very interested in the role of faith-based organizations and actors in the world. And he invited all of these religious leaders to come together to be there for the Millennium Summit in the year 2000. That was the year that the United Nations put together the predecessor of what are today's Sustainable Development Goals, known as the Millennium Development Goals. This was the largest, and I believe the largest to date, gathering of religious leaders at the United Nations. And they are here delivering a declaration from themselves to Kofi Annan to demonstrate their support for the goals of eradicating poverty by 2015. That was the beginning of a takeoff, and for us, a welcome change in the way in which the United Nations views faith-based actors. And so we have moved from a period of allergy to a period of embrace. This UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development was founded around the year 2010, and over the years has grown to include all of these UN agencies who have established work that they do with faith-based organizations. Last year, 2018, they established a multi-faith advisory council of religious leaders who gather together to work with these UN agencies to accomplish common goals. So that is a very, very brief snapshot of the ebb and flow of the river of faith at the United Nations. And now we're going to go into some of the successes and challenges and obstacles that faith-based organizations have had in their work with the UN. And again, this is going to be a zero-carbon flyover, shall we say, because of time, but I'm happy to talk to you later. First of all, a little bit about the UN context. And I'm so grateful that I came after Professor Beth Hollins because she has done a lot of the work for me here, so I will not belabor the point. But these are some of the major frameworks that somehow touch on climate change. I'm sure by now we all know them, so I won't belabor the point. The main thing I wanted to point out, however, is that I included the Sustainable Development Goals, which we might not think of necessarily as directly related to climate change, as well as the more recent Global Compact on Migration. How many of you are familiar with this framework? So the Sustainable Development Goals came into being in 2015 because guess what? We haven't eradicated poverty. But we have another 15 years to do so. And he came up with 17 goals, all of which actually touch directly on climate change. And I propose to you today to see this as a framework, regardless of whether you are working in a faith context or not, as a framework to complement how we can live more sustainably and how we can become more resilient so that our professor scientist will agree that it's still hopeful. If you go to the UN Environment page, here is a wonderful infographic which will be quite useful for you in the local communities where you find yourselves. A nice little way of describing climate action, and you can find more of these materials on the UN's website. Here are just a few. I should have added etc. down here. Just a few of the agencies or panels that the UN is currently using in order to frame its work on climate change and water. One of the things I discovered in doing research for this presentation today is that many of these organizations, in particular UNICEF and UNESCO, which is not on here, have been working on the issue of water from the point of view of having safe, healthy drinking water, and have not necessarily made a connection to climate change. It's in a different part of the UN system. And so if you go to the United Nations in July, like I did, and listen to a talk on this, you will hear that the agencies themselves are rethinking their work around water to take into account the effects of climate change, and also to incorporate that into existing work related specifically to water. I just want to point out to you two other initiatives within the UN environment that work very closely with faith actors. One is called the Faith for Earth Initiative, just held an assembly in earlier this year, the United Nations Environmental Assembly. And this one, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, which works with local religious leaders, specifically indigenous leaders, in various rainforests around the world. So please pray for these folks because they are at the center of what's happening right now. So what exactly do faith-based actors do? Here's a little typology of things that they do in general, not necessarily being connected with the United Nations. Publishing references to sacred scriptures, issuing multi-faith declarations, pilgrimage, protests, marches, mass mobilization, interfaith conversation among themselves, storytelling. Here's one very good example. Some of us may have actually been involved in a People's Climate March in 2014. It happened around the world. And I'm sure all of you here are familiar with Laudato Si. Yes? Great. Laudato Si has had an enormous effect on the UN system. It is truly extraordinary to see the extent to which it has been embraced. And 2015 is being called the Year of Declarations. It had a ripple effect in that other faith traditions also issued declarations that year relating to their scriptures and how they saw care for creation. Reverend Rachel Carnegie will be happy to see this slide. This is an example of a more local action that connects with the United Nations. And I think we know this fine gentleman here as well. This was the Anglican Alliance as part of the Anglican Communion and had a roundtable earlier this year to discuss this and invited, from what I understand, local political officials and UN representatives, which is a very interesting and important way in which we connect the local with the global. A more formal way in which faith-based organizations participate in the United Nations is through attending UN meetings and participating in negotiations. Professor Beth gave us a beautiful example of what it is like to be part of the negotiations. I must say I was sitting there with envy because those of us who work on the faith-based side do not get invited into those negotiations. It's quite special to be part of the delegation. So congratulations to you. The rest of us benefit. Some of us are trying to get in the room and knocking hard at the door. So these are the various ways: networking, information sharing, bilateral and multilateral advocacy, and especially during UN meetings, attending the meetings as observers, addressing them, lobbying, organizing side and parallel events, prayer and worship services, and participating in advocacy programs. Here's an example from our Episcopal Church. This was our first delegation to the COPs that we've been attending every year since then. And this is in actually a non-UN space within the UN meeting where we have gathered for interfaith prayer. We had a beautiful turnout, and I invite you to talk with Bishop Mark and Sheila perhaps during dinner or myself, and we can tell you exactly how important it was to have this opportunity for faith to come together and worship in prayer. We didn't see much else happening that year in that space, but it was truly a magnificent moment. And we heard from negotiators afterwards how important it was for them to know that we were there praying for them. And with them, they did come to us. Here's another example of ways in which faith-based organizations participate from the Anglican Communion, which has taken up the issue of climate-induced migration that we've been hearing about these past 2 days. This is not at all the full statement. You can read it on the Anglican Communion's website. The important thing to know is that a document like this is usually issued before a meeting, in this case the UN High-Level Political Forum on the SDGs, as a way of lobbying for the inclusion of this particular subject and bringing attention to it to the negotiators who are gathering for the meeting. And finally, a more general way, and sort of the marathon way in which we engage with the UN, is networking and developing partnerships and bringing the stories to the fore of what we are doing and what we can contribute, knocking on doors, shaking hands, showing up, putting out social media, letting the world know that we are there and that we care. The ministry of presence is incredibly important. It can be virtual, does not need to be physical. This is another example from the Quaker United Nations office, a way in which they are contributing to what member states are doing by providing technical expertise, a full 30-page report that they have written for government officials with all kinds of advice about the various policy-making decisions that they are making. And this is an example of mission visits. As part of this, of the preparation for this presentation, I asked Joanna where you all were coming from, because I wanted to contact your member states to see what kind of advice they had for you as we're gathered here on the best ways to engage. And so this is the the ambassador of Samoa. He insisted that I be in the picture. I didn't want to be. We had an hour-long discussion, which is very, very significant, in which he talked about the importance of faith-based organizations. We're going to hear a little more from him in just a second. And this is your ambassador to Fiji in New York, who knows that you're gathered here today and also has some advice and some encouragement to bring to you that I'll talk about in just a moment. So those are examples of mission visits where we call them up and say, we're having this conference happening in Lincoln. We have some students and leaders coming from your country, and we're going to talk about the importance of faith at the United Nations. What do you have to say to them? And so they have provided something for you. So as I mentioned, as part of the research for this, I decided not to just focus on what I know and have learned, and nor just to focus on what it is to be from an academic looking at the field, but also to draw upon the people I know who are involved as UN representatives of faith-based organizations, to talk to member states and to talk to UN agencies and to ask them these particular questions. What do you see as the role of faith-based organizations? What successes have they had? What challenges and obstacles? And what advice for engaging strategically in an era of climate emergency? So these were the responses I received from these faith-based organizations, these member states, and these UN agencies. For somebody who's interested in doing a doctorate, there's a lot of work to be done in this area, so I was not able to find much in my reading. And so what have they described? And this is from their perspective, as well as the other sources I mentioned. Faith values are more widely known now within the UN system. A lot of that is the push that has happened since the Paris Agreement, but it continues to be the case because UN agencies have woken up to the fact that faith actors matter. Faith-based actors and religious actors are recognized for their ethical and moral leadership. One person shared with me the fact that we are not political as such, we're not part of a member state, is very important because we can go into the room representing a faith background. We also have niche areas of expertise. One of them is the role that spiritual leaders play around climate grief. Another is around preaching from the pulpits. The Fijian ambassador said, the church needs to up its game. I want to hear more preaching from the pulpits. Those are his words. I agree with him, but this comes directly from him. He said that the faith-based bodies have teachings that need to be shared with the rest of the world. You have your pulpits, please use them. Those are his words. He also shared that in his community, which is, I'm going to mess it up, it's from Fiji, and it was that big island that featured in Professor Beth's presentation. He comes from a tiny little village there, and an Anglican school from which 4 ambassadors to the United Nations have come. And he talked about the fact that Anglican schools have had a huge impact around the world. And in particular, he also mentioned that the simple way of life of the communities of the people back home, which he knows are attached to the Anglican tradition, inspire him as a way that he can live going forward. As a result, he has given up bottled Fiji water, giving that out at the mission in New York. His employees are not happy with him. They said, we need to help promote our businesses. But he said, no, that comes from dirty energy all the way across the world. We do not need to have Fiji bottled water in the Fijian mission. So good for him. They identified the fact that faith communities and faith leaders are very attached to their local communities as opposed to UN level processes or leaders. The Samoan ambassador said, I don't know what's happening with the fish in the sea back home. I need to talk to the fishermen to know what's happening with the fish. And that's why I need local level leaders in order to tell me what needs to happen. And so that is a very deep connection that other non-governmental organizations do not necessarily have. And finally, I touched on this already, the Anglican Communion, it's already been mentioned, is the 3rd largest faith body in the world and has tremendous reach and influence. So we can rejoice that they have a representation at the United Nations. Challenges and obstacles. Very limited scope of action within the UN system because of the role and place of faith-based organizations. Internal limitations and constraints. The Episcopal Church is a good example. They have 1 person at the United Nations. I can't do it all. And so, of course, we have other representatives, but they have other jobs. And so it is only possible to do so much usually as a staff and a budget and the will of your organization will allow you to do. How do we measure success? Professor Beth has given us a very good example of what that might look like. But for most faith-based actors, they don't know if a mission visit is going to change anything, whether that's going to change a text or not. And so there is a part of faith in doing this work because it's almost impossible to quantify whether we are having any kind of influence. And often we can say the influence is within ourselves, our own transformation in understanding our importance in the world as people of faith. Faith actors are used by the United Nations system, there is no question about that. And that is a danger and a risk that we need to be aware of as we continue to engage with the UN. And finally, the same factors that we all deal with, denial, doom, and distance. So what lessons can be learned from these interviews and from these discussions with faith-based actors? And what does smart engagement look like in an era where we don't have the time of a marathon to build relationships within the UN context. I'm going to give you a quick video from the UN Secretary General about their perspective of the current crisis.
Today I'm appealing for leadership from politicians, from business and scientists, and from the public everywhere. We have the tools to make our actions effective. What we still lack, even after the Paris Agreement, is the leadership and the ambition to do what is needed. And what makes all of this even more disturbing is that we were warned. Scientists have been telling us for decades, over and over again. And far too many leaders have refused to listen. And far too few have acted with the vision the science demands. And we see the results. In some situations, they are approaching scientists' worst-case scenarios. The world's richest nations are the most responsible for the climate crisis, yet the effects are being felt first and worst by the poorest nations and the most vulnerable peoples and communities. Existing technologies are waiting to come online: cleaner fuels, alternative building materials, better batteries, and advances in farming and land use. And these and other innovations can have a major role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so we can hit the Paris targets and inject the great ambition that is so urgently needed. Let us use the next year for transformational decisions in boardrooms, executive suites, and parliaments across the world. Let us raise our sights, build coalitions, and make our leaders listen. There is no more time to waste. As the ferocity of this summer's wildfires and heatwaves shows, the world is changing before our eyes. We are careering towards the edge of the abyss. It is not too late to shift course, but every day that passes means the world eats up a little more, and the cost of our inaction mounts. Every day we fail to act is a day that we step a little closer towards a fate that none of us want. The fate that will resonate through generations in the damage done to humankind and life on Earth. Our fate is in our hands. The world is counting on all of us to rise to the challenge before it is too late. I count on you all.
We've heard stories of resilience. We've heard stories of solutions. There's nothing that stands in the way between us and acting at this global level. Climate change affects us locally, but in order to achieve the ambition that is needed and to find the solutions, we need a global solution as well. And that starts with our PowerPoints. So I will just keep freewheeling here. Thank you. So what does it look like to have smart engagement in an era of climate emergencies? I propose to you that this is not a complete list because it doesn't have your input. So see this as a starting point of what has been proposed to you by those who are involved in the work already. Some of whom knew that they were going to be speaking to you indirectly today through me. Stay at home, stay local, reduce your carbon footprint. Focus on solutions. It was emphasized to me, especially by the two ambassadors I spoke with, that the time for speeches is over. The time for negotiations is over, Now is the time for solutions, exactly the types of solutions that we have seen proposed in this room. The government leaders want to hear about our solutions through mitigation and through adaptation, and we have things to share. Push for local and national implementation, most specifically of the Paris Agreement, but all the other UN agreements that I have not spoken about today. We can talk about it more. The ambassadors talked to me about massaging the advocacy message. If you have a carnivore, don't tell them they have to give up meat. Tell them, well, maybe beans today. They can go back to meat tomorrow. People are not necessarily ready to engage at the same levels. And it's important to know who your audience is and adapt to something that feels doable for them. Prioritize, this is very specific advice, interfaith. We know from the United Nations perspective that the UN prefers that faith organizations work together in interfaith coalitions, not ecumenical, not single religions, but interfaith. Prioritize mass mobilization and civil disobedience. And prioritize youth action. That should be obvious. Size matters. So figure out very carefully in this vast Moana of UN agencies, if you will, where exactly your precise action is going to take place. And there are people such as myself and my counterpart who can help you. And finally, engage the UN from where you are. Now, I have some examples here. I believe the PowerPoints will be shared with you, I hope, and I'd be happy to send it to you afterwards. In the interest of time, and knowing that we're slightly droopy right before dinner, I'm not going to go into all of these. But I encourage you to think of the United Nations in the palm of your hand. You have that ability to connect. And you need to connect, quite frankly, if you're not already. I'm sure you are. You can also engage more broadly if you wanted to go to someplace more distant, like New York, like Nairobi, like Geneva. There are ways to engage there, and we can help you. So I wanted to provide you with some very specific tools. And this is one of them, my colleague Jack Palmer-White, who is in London, who is the UN's representative for the Anglican Communion. He knows he couldn't be here today. I bring greetings from him, and I have his business cards, and he's looking forward to connecting with you. So if you are part of the Anglican Communion, this is your guy. He is the one that's going to help you navigate the UN system. This is our Episcopal Church UN representation. Feel free to call me anytime as well. Call upon Bishop Mark and Sheila if you want to know more about some of the other areas of our action, like the COPs in particular. But these are the ways to contact us and to connect. And social media is an enormous tool that is used quite extensively within the UN. Now, I wanted to leave you with a message of hope. And here it is. Do we know who this person is? Yes. Who is this person? Greta, and where is she? She's in New York. She's in New York. What is she doing?
She's getting ready for Climate Week.
She's getting ready for the Climate Action Summit, which is September 23rd. You are all invited to participate via social media. Greta has just shown up, and we in this shot are in New York Harbor, which is a confluence of rivers, by the way. This comes from, I think, this past weekend with TDI. I wanted you to see the picture, this picture first. There's a little tiny story behind it. And juxtapose it with this picture. Does anybody know where this picture came from? This picture came from Greta's Twitter account. So presumably, I can't know for sure, she took this picture. And what is she looking at? The Statue of Liberty in New York. And do you know what's surrounding her?
The SDGs.
One vote for each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is something you can grab onto as an easy tool in order to focus not only on eradicating poverty, but addressing climate change in a time of climate emergency. This picture, for me at least, is hugely symbolic because the Statue of Liberty is there. Now, as an American, I'm not the most patriotic of Americans. I've traveled quite a bit. I like to think of myself as a world citizen. But this symbol, especially living in New York, means a great deal to me. It welcomes refugees. It welcomes immigrants. important that welcome is going to be, and how much it is a part of all of our traditions of faith. It's so symbolic, especially at a time when the United States, in my opinion, is not on the right road in how it welcomes people in need. But for me, it is very specific and very important that Greta sailed into New York Harbor and was met by the Statue of Liberty. So I want to close with 2 words of faith and 2 words of inspiration for you. The first is from the poem on the Statue of Liberty, and the second is from Dr. Hammarskjöld. I'm going to read it aloud. This is written on a plaque at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride, from land to land. Sorry, I might get emotional. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand flows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. My brothers and sisters, people of faith and people of hope, this is our call to action. We will need to welcome. We will need to be those who are teaching what radical welcome and hospitality looks like, so that we do not build walls, and so that we do receive those who are in need. And so my prayer for all of us today is that we will see the United Nations as one tool which will teach us how we can connect, and our faith traditions as a primary teaching of what welcome looks like. And I close with a man of faith from the United Nations and a very simple prayer to encourage that action. From Dr. Hammarskjöld's markings, for all that has been, thanks. For all that shall be, yes. Thank you very much.
So in that case, thank you very much again for your presentation. I'd like to invite questions, and I think I saw one from Bishop.
I was cheering.
Oh, sorry. one from over here initially, so give you the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for that speech. It was very interesting to hear how faith-based organisations can work within a very multicultural organisation, so it's gratifying to see there is some cooperation there. I've been doing research on how water, and I mentioned it yesterday, how water agreements and water treaties can be a first step in resolving conflicts between states and starting a process of more bilateral agreements. Are there many programs among faith-based organisations to promote these and work with these around the world, and can this be a kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone and resolving conflicts and resolving climate issues at the same time?
Should I answer directly now or take another question?
I was just
Let
wondering.
me just answer your question because it's very specific and I tend to forget. Can you hear me still?
Yes.
No. Put it on mute. Okay. Is this better?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. There is such a thing, a field known as water diplomacy, that is not necessarily new, but it's not an area that has received a lot of focus. There is a whole framework of organizations within the United Nations system that work on water. That's not my area of expertise per se. So I would have to talk to you more and work with you a little bit in order to do that. One interesting fact, but kind of disturbing, that I discovered and could be a future point of advocacy is that UN Water, which is another interagency way in which the UN deals with water issues across programs and funds and agencies, does not have any faith-based partnerships. And I found that quite astounding because I'm used to working with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, other UN agencies that work with us quite closely. And UN Water does not have anything related to faith-based organizations. Whether that will change in future, I don't know. But they do have a program related to water diplomacy very specifically.
Are there no initiatives for involving faith-based organizations in this? Because it can be a useful track to
It certainly would. I was absolutely, just flabbergasted. But I did ask directly. And I was told, no, we have some civil society partners, but nothing with faith-based organizations. So that will likely be a place that we push in future. But I can go deeper with you in conversation about what's out there related specifically to regulating conflict.
Okay, thank you.
Questions from down the front from here.
Thanks, Lynnaia, for your wonderful presentation. As you keep an eye on the sort of the flow of words through the United Nations in debates and documents and the rest, do expressions of faith sort of bob to the surface once in a while, or is it kept rather hidden? Indeed, as Dag Hammarskjöld kept it rather personal and buried away in markings.
Thank you. I would say the current atmosphere, this is more of a subjective response, is that it is fashionable, shall we say, to accept faith-based actors and organizations within the UN system. Now, what I did not mention is that the Holy See is actually an observer, so not in the same, it's a sort of higher level category than the rest of us faith-based actors, and they play an enormous role, which is partially why the Pope's encyclical has resonated so much in the UN system. So we can thank them for that, because they help to bring the rest of us along. Technically, the United Nations is secular. If you talk to a member state, especially a diplomat, they will tell you that. They won't tell you anything else. But we have been on mission visits where, for example, we have gone in to talk about gender equality, and we've had an ambassador tell us he's a person of faith and can he pray for us? We've had someone working for another mission who we went to talk to about another subject, and we never got to our subject. He wanted to talk about the fact that he wanted to be a priest. So a lot of this happens behind the curtains, shall we say, and that is why mission visits in particular can be so helpful. One thing I forgot to mention about our Fijian ambassador, and he told me, I told him I was going to share everything, and he gave me his permission. He said he is a person he is spiritual, but not religious. But then he identified as Hindu. But then he said that he goes to the Anglican church when he's back home because he went to Anglican boarding schools. But he said, I used to think about God maybe 9 times in 10 years. But now because of what's happening with my country, I think about God at least 3 times a day because of what's happening with Fiji. Now, would he have said this in a speech? No. But that is where faith-based organizations, I'm a layperson, so I'm not there to ask anybody what the state of their faith is, but we often find that just representing a faith-based organization, they will voluntarily tell us, oh, I haven't been to church in so long, and this is from ambassadors. We also are very clear in the statements we write as the Episcopal Church, and I'm sure the Anglican Communion is the same, to always go back to our theological values, because if we don't, it doesn't make any difference, because we're not being true to who we are.
Thank you for that awesome and very informative presentation. I'd just like to make a comment. When Kofi Annan was the Secretary General, I received an autographed book by his wife about tip and top. 2 raindrops and their journey from the clouds through to how the humans used tip and top and how they were separated. I think that's where my passion for, how I use water developed.
Wow.
And it's just, I think growing up now, and I'm still young at heart, but as we all are in this room, that little book I received in New York when I was there really pushed me to find out more about it. So I'm just hoping there's still more resources like that for the young ones,
There are.
apart from Twitter and so forth. But
Yes.
these are really important things that can be filtered into how we learn more about these things. But thank you very much for everything.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for that.
I'd love to hear that in guest Galapagos too. But yes, I can tell you that the United Nations has a gift shop with plenty of materials for children to explain all kinds of things, including welcoming refugees, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. This was a PowerPoint designed for a particular audience of a particular age group, including yourself. And so I didn't go into children's resources, but I can assure you that they are plenty and they're lots of fun.
Yeah, actually my comment relates to that. Saying to some people, with my kids, I'm going through the SDG book club, so every month we're looking at another book. It's a global conversation. And my suggestion for those who aren't familiar with the SDGs is to look up to good life goals, because they're a very accessible way of making global goals local. And that would be my suggestion for those who aren't familiar with it.
Any further questions? So there's one over here.
Just a quick comment. That was fabulous, Lynnaia. Yay! I was just really drawn to Professor Holland's backstory this morning when she talked about going across Paris and taking teams, bringing people together. And I have a brief backstory to share from Poland last year, which might bring some understanding of the capacity of faith bodies and faith groups working with the UN to help support change. And that is that the IPCC 2018 report was received by the UN with great appreciation, except by the US delegation and a couple of other countries. And there was a movement to change the language of welcome, which would have diminished the application of the science to set country goals on emission targets. And it was actually a bit of a crisis. I mean, it was actually a moment of great concern in Poland last year. And when the news was released, Mark sat down in the hall and started writing. Our whole team gathered, the whole team, Lynnaia included, worked on a statement that was a pushback to the US delegation. It went through our governmental affairs office. It was approved by our presiding bishop. It was presented to the US delegation. The head of the delegation is an Episcopalian. And the words changed. Now, I'm not going to say we were the only reason for it, because there was a lot of pressure, but we were there to register what our policy position is. This is not just individual feelings. We were working from voted on policy positions on how the Episcopal Church views science and how that relates to climate change. The second thing is, the next day, Patricia Espinosa, who heads the UNFCCC, met with faith leaders and others who wanted to join her. And she said in the meeting, and I believe very sincerely, we need you, we need your voice, just as some of these ambassadors with whom you've met. So I just offer this as an encouragement that the participation of the church does matter, I think. Thank you.
I'm going to close. Thank you very much, Lynnaia, once again. I'm going to close things there, but before I do that, can we please thank